button. Okay. All right. Why don't we start introductions? Well, I suspect some other people will still be popping in. So I will ask my co-lead Chris to introduce himself.
Well, thank you, Lynn. I'm Chris Van Dalen, on the board with the Thurston Climate Action Team, and also a member of the Northwest Eco Building Guild and chair our South Sound chapter. I'll pass it on to Greg Queaton, our other co-lead on this project.
Hello, I'm Greg Queaton. I'm a climate scientist and researcher, and also a volunteer with the TCAT group about buildings and commercial buildings and energy efficiency.
Carolyn Cox, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Carolyn. I serve on the Lacey City Council, and I've been part of the developing the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, and I'm still on the steering committee that's developing the implementation plans.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. Barbara, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Barbara Whitlow with OLIFED. Nice to be here. Great to see everybody.
Oh, and I see Jason was able to join us. You want to introduce yourself, Jason?
Good morning. Thank you. Sorry I'm late. Jason Gano, Government Affairs Director, Olympia Master Builders.
Great. Glad to have you. Aaron, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I'm Aaron Dumas. I'm with the Northwest Eco Building Guild and the TCAT Buildings as Climate Action Team.
Thank you. Let's see, Melinda.
Hey, I think I met some of you, not all of you though, but I'm Melinda Hughes. I'm the Executive Director for TCAT. So, hi. This is my first one of these, so it's nice to be here.
Welcome.
Great. Tom Schrader. You're gonna have to unmute, Tom.
Hi, this is Tom Schrader. I'm the TCRA president. We're having cleaning done in the house today. And I'm also a RE/MAX Parkside commercial and residential broker. And look forward to today's discussion.
Great, thanks for joining. Allison.
Hey everyone, Allison Osterberg with Thurston Regional Planning Council, and I'm a coordinator on the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan and just here to listen.
Great, thanks Allison. Let's see, Zach.
About that, yep, Zach Histeros, Prime Locations.
Thank you, Zach. Evan.
Thank you. This is Evan Parker with Kidder Matthews, commercial real estate.
Great. And person who is on the telephone, I'm afraid I don't know who you are, so you'll just have to identify yourself.
7050174 number.
Mm-hmm.
That's Evan Parker.
Ah, okay.
I'm sorry, I had to join on the phone.
That's okay. Thanks for clarifying. All right. Well, I think we've introduced everyone except our speaker. So I just want to basically say my appreciation that Lukas took the time to put this presentation together for us and to make himself available to share of his experience around commercial audits. And I'll let him say anything else he wants to say to kind of, Chris is waving that he's going to say something to introduce Lukas. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, yes, I mean, I just wanted to also thank Lukas, but OBrien360 has been a long player in this realm of energy efficient buildings in the commercial space for a long time. I'm sure you're going to talk a little bit more about that, but we've got some great expertise here. I also just wanted to recap, for everyone that in the last meeting we had, discussed some of the elements of the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan that relate to commercial buildings. And, while there's a variety of options ranging from benchmarking policy to, a performance standard for commercial buildings less than 25,000 feet, we kind of we're trying to start the conversation out in a place where it it seems like the most doable piece is, like we did in residential, we're looking at in residential is looking at, can we add a requirement for just doing a commercial energy audit at the time of sale or major renovation that would allow the owners and the leasers to understand more about the building and the energy costs thereof. And since then, there's just been so much activity in the commercial space. A lot of new buildings coming online, or in the pipeline to be built. A lot of those are getting some incentives from the city of Olympia for going beyond the building energy codes. And so I think there's a real opportunity here, and we want to find out how easy and valuable it can be from doing a commercial energy audit, and what that would provide to the developers as well as the folks looking at renting a space from them. So Lucas is going to share with us some of the different levels of energy audits that could apply to commercial spaces, and I really appreciate you taking the time, Lucas. Welcome.
And I forgot to let one person introduce themselves. I'm sorry, Thad, you want to introduce yourself?
I got here a little late. Sorry. I'm Thad Kurtz. I've done a bunch of volunteer work for Carbon Washington and for TCAT.
Thank you, Thad. Okay, take it away, Lucas.
That was a long intro.
All right. So yeah, Lukas Hovee with OBrien360. There's a short amount of history here. OBrien360 is the recent, I guess, 2 to 3 year old merger of O'Brien and Company and 360 Analytics. I don't know, some of you may be familiar with either of those firms. O'Brien and Company has been in the field for over 25 years. Started by Kathleen O'Brien, sort of a pioneer in the green building industry. 360 Analytics was myself and David Reddy for something on the order of 12 years before we merged with O'Brien and Company, and we really focused on, we're both engineers. We like to nerd out on energy, and you'll see probably a little bit of that reflected here in the presentation. I hope it's not too much. And we, so that was our focus, is understanding how buildings use energy and helping people reduce that, either in new construction and or in existing buildings. I myself did a lot of energy modeling, some energy auditing, and a lot of other types of analysis for about 10 years before I got into the commissioning space, and that's where I mostly am now. So that's kind of a caveat. I'm not actively engaged in a lot of audit work right now, but I am familiar with the space and have experience with it. So yeah, let's jump in. See if I can figure out how to make this slide go forward. Just some context. I think Chris already alluded to this, but in terms of the climate mitigation plan, there's a large series of strategies and actions regarding commercial buildings, and I'm really going to focus on just 2 here. That is benchmarking and disclosure and energy audits. And as you'll see, these 2 are kind of interrelated. And so that's why I picked both of them, even though the request was for audits specifically. And then some background material. I want to acknowledge the fact that much of what you're going to see here is straight out of a document produced by Ashrae. Ashrae is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. The book is entitled Procedures for Commercial Building Audits. It's very detailed, and it's got some sample material in it as well that would probably be useful if and when this group decided to start putting a program together. Other resources that we're going to talk about a little bit, and I think that could be useful to people on the team. City of Seattle's energy benchmarking requirement. That's been around now for 4 or 5 years, and it's if nothing else, it's a rich treasure trove of data. If you like data, Puget Sound Energy Obviously, the utility out there in Thurston County for gas and electric. They have two things that are interesting. One is a program called My Data, which allows you to get a hold of your energy consumption data for your building and look at it in a variety of ways. And it's in their commercial incentive program. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but maybe just allude to it as a resource for further investigation as, you know, this team looks at sort of the space surrounding energy audits. How do you pay for them? What are the benefits? Who can help? That kind of stuff. Energy Star Portfolio Manager as well is something we're going to talk about a little bit. That's a tool produced by the Department of Energy that also assists with benchmarking buildings. These three services are actually all interconnected in the sense that if you are participating in the energy benchmarking disclosure requirements in the city of Seattle, you're likely using Energy Star Portfolio Manager to report to the city, and you're likely using PSE to auto-populate data into Portfolio Manager. So there's some interconnection there. I wanted to apologize too if folks are familiar with this book. And there looks like there's some people on the call who may have some knowledge of this, and so I may be regurgitating a lot of what you already know. If you want to dive in deeper, just raise your hand and holler. Just some definitions before we get started. Energy use intensity is a normalized metric for comparing energy consumption of buildings across buildings with different fuel types, different sizes, different uses. It's abbreviated EUI. Ashrae guidelines and standards will maybe hit on this just a little bit. I think this concept could be useful for this group. So guidelines are documents that describe how something is done. Ways to achieve something. There's a guideline on energy auditing. It's the procedures for commercial building energy audits we talked about. Ashrae also produces standards, and standards are essentially models for jurisdictions or other entities that want to prescriptively require something. So if a jurisdiction wanted to require an energy audit, they could use one of the Ashrae standards as a model for outlining that program. A great example of this in action is the Washington State Energy Code. The Washington State Energy Code is built on top of a model energy code, the International Energy Code, International Energy Conservation Code, IECC. That's not an Ashrae standard, that's a different organization, but it used to be built on Ashrae 90.1, which is also a model standard, model code. Back up. Audit versus assessment. Ostensibly today we're talking about energy audits. I just want to say that there's kind of a push to change terminology going on here. Towards away from audit and towards assessment. Audit implies it maybe has a negative connotation. It implies, you know, somebody looking over your shoulder and trying to find out what you've done wrong. That's not what an energy audit is. An energy audit or assessment is essentially a tool that helps a building owner understand where they're using energy and where they can find savings. Energy versus power. I put this on here because there's a slight reference to it, but we probably won't get into it. Remember, energy is an amount of something that you use over time. So it's like a bucket full of water. Power is how fast you're using energy. So it's like the rate at which the bucket drains when you're dumping it over. In energy land, this is often referred to, or also shows up in the concept of consumption, energy consumption versus demand. Demand is how fast, again, are you using energy. Last, energy conservation measure. This is just when you have an audit done, you may end up with a list of ECMs, energy conservation measures, to evaluate further. Okay, So using Ashrae as the model for talking about audits, because number one, this is all predefined somewhere, and number two, you can go read about it further if you want. Their model essentially has 4 levels, strangely numbered level 0, benchmarking or preliminary energy analysis, level 1, 2, and 3. So the level 0, it says benchmarking here. This is, Ashrae refers to it as the preliminary energy analysis. This is just the act of collecting your energy consumption data, and maybe not just energy, maybe energy and water and garbage, that kind of stuff. Collecting it all in one place, normalizing it so you can compare it against it internally against itself and externally against other buildings, and reporting it. So that is the first step of no matter which level of energy audit you're wanting to do. We will always consider the first step to be, how much energy are you using now? This is classic, was it Lee Iacocca who said you can't manage what you don't measure? It's a classic thing. So the first step is always getting an understanding of where you are. Then there's 3 other levels we'll talk about in more detail. Level 1 is usually referred to as a walkthrough audit. Level 2 is a little more detailed, and level 3 is maybe to be considered an investment grade audit or something like that. When you're talking about a lot of money on the line to make some large capital improvements, you may want some more analysis done before spending that money. So the preliminary energy assessment, what I'm calling level 0. Essentially, as I alluded to, the goal here is to review your utility bills, calculate an energy cost index, which was not something on the definitions page, and an energy utilization index. EUI is usually reported in 1,000 BTUs per square foot, and it ranges from 10 to 15 all the way up to maybe 100 for a really energy intensive building. 100,000 BTUs per square foot per year. So here's some, I actually took this out of a energy audit that we had done for a project a while back. Just getting the data in one place. This can be challenging. We work a lot with large multifamily, which is technically a commercial building in the sense that it's governed by the commercial codes. Oftentimes these buildings have upwards of 100 meters that you have to figure out how to get information from the utility, which is always a challenge, and then amalgamate it. So this is just one of the utilities that this particular project used. It was also used steam, and we'll see some of that later. So just looking at the data over time, you can start to see things, especially an experienced energy manager can start to see things like, why is there a 20% bump in peak energy consumption in this 3rd year here? Maybe that's something to look at. All of the levels refer to taking a look at your peak demand as well. The utility will track peak demand, and that's how they, among other things, that's how they slot you into a certain rate structure. There's always recommendations to make sure you're in the right rate structure based on your peak demand. I personally don't have a lot of experience with finding this to be a problem with our clients. They typically tend to be in the right rate structure here. I have heard anecdotal stories from colleagues about working on a lot of projects where this was a huge savings. Last part about this is, so you're reviewing your utility bills, you're calculating an EUI, and then the last thing is to determine some kind of what's referred to as a target EUI. It's a reasonable assumption about what your building could do if it was performing better. There's a lot of sources for this. Energy Star Portfolio Manager has the CBEX database built into it. That's the Commercial Building Energy consumption survey, which is a study that's done every so many years. I think by the state of California. Oftentimes a building owner has a portfolio of buildings and they can be compared against each other. There's other sources, City of Seattle benchmarking data, like I mentioned earlier, and sort of the new elephant on the horizon, the House Bill 1257, which is the Washington State Building Performance Standard. Among other things, it provides target EUIs for different building types, which is actually pretty useful. So there's been a lot of data going into and research going into determining, all right, if we're going to require a building performance standard in the state of Washington, what is a reasonable requirement that's both energy efficient and not overburdensome? And then reporting the rough order of magnitude savings if you reach the target. So this can be, especially if you're looking at a portfolio of buildings, this can be an excellent tool for screening. If you want to do deeper energy audit, if you want to save energy in your portfolio, doing this analysis, this level 0 analysis on all of your buildings first, obviously gives you an opportunity to identify places where there's opportunity for savings. I've got an example benchmarking table here of a project we did a while back. You can see that, and these are all publicly available data. I was going to blur out the names of these buildings, but it's all in the benchmarking database, so you can go find it yourself as well. The analysis was done for this Lehigh's Fry Apartments to determine where they are in terms of other typical buildings. Any questions on that? Yeah, Ted.
Technical question. My understanding was that PSC had to supply aggregated building use for multifamily buildings. It sounds like that's not as simple as I thought it was.
Yeah. Well, the problem is it's never right. Oh. So we've probably done, I don't know, 20 of these in the last couple of years. And the meter list has never been correct once. And so it can get tricky to, basically what it requires is somebody's got to go on site and write down all the meter numbers and then compare them against the list that PSE provides and get their database corrected. It's an endless source of frustration, actually, because it seems like it should be straightforward, but if you look at it from the utilities point of view, they've got multiple accounts, people moving in and out at different time scales, and it's very hard to get the right meter list. And it's not just PSE, all the utilities we've worked with have this problem. We mentioned this a little bit. Tools and resources that are available for helping with preliminary energy assessment. Kind of talked about all of them except for, so we got Portfolio Manager, which I can just bring up real quickly. I have a Portfolio Manager account open so you can see what it looks like. This is what Energy Star Portfolio Manager looks like. It's got summary data for a building. It gives you your current EUI based on the last 12 months. An energy baseline that's definable by the user. So it can be a previous year. It can be a target if you've created a target value in here. You can get your details out of it. This is the details of how the building is set up. And this is actually also a source of difficulty with the preliminary energy assessment, and why it's helpful to have an energy auditor do it, is just understanding when you have a building that has multiple uses in it, how do you enter it into Portfolio Manager such that it gets slotted into the right categories for comparison against the database of other buildings. Again, the summary, one thing I didn't mention, and let's see if it if it's where this is reported.
Lucas,
Okay,
could
it's
you
not-
use your Zoom and zoom in on the
Yeah.
screen a bit there? That'd be great.
How's that? Okay.
Much better, thanks.
Yeah. So this will also calculate an Energy Star score. I don't know why we don't have one on this building, other than it may not be this building type may not be eligible for score, but I'm pretty sure it is. So there must be something missing in this setup here. Let's see. Oh, here we go. So the current Energy Star score for this building is 95. This is a pretty efficient building. It was designed for net zero. It's not quite meeting the net zero target, but it's close. And what 95 means in the Energy Star score is it's doing better than 95% of its contemporaries, other buildings with the same, or it's in the 95th percentile of performance. So that right there is a pretty good benchmarking tool. If you enter your buildings in here and you're getting values above 50, you can say, I'm doing pretty well. I'm above, I'm above the 50th percentile. I'm doing better than the average. You enter your data in here and it's reading 20 or 30, you've got some opportunity there. So that's Portfolio Manager. It's also nice. You can export it. You can create a variety of reports, export them. There's some official reports that come out of Energy Star Portfolio Manager that are used for certain certification programs. Housing and Urban Development has basically a low interest loan program that requires Energy Star reporting, Energy Star certification, those kind of things. I mentioned PSE My Data. That's just that tool on its own has a little bit of capability for analysis, but its biggest use by far is auto-populating data into Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And this is where that meter aggregation happens. That is in their My Data program. So this is where we go when we think there's a problem with our data to make sure it's right. I don't know if I showed it before, Seattle's energy benchmarking database. We talked about this. This is a map that essentially shows all the buildings that are reporting. You can zoom in and out. This is, I mean, for a person like me, this is super interesting and cool to have this data available. I mean, I can go and look at, I can look at our office here and say, well, I don't even know, how is our office performing? Here it is, the Dexter Horton building, 33.2, that's pretty good, Energy Star score of 92. That's fun. And I think the other thing that we'll talk about later on is that this, or we can talk about it now, this, when I showed you the analysis that we did, see if I can figure out how to go backwards in my presentation here. For this Fry Apartments building, some of this data I had from other energy audits we had, but I needed some more benchmarks. And so I was able to just go into the Energy Star data or the City of Seattle benchmarking database and grab a few more from the same owner. And that was, in terms of making this first step inexpensive and easy, it was a huge benefit. Yes. So other tools we talked about. The only other tool that we could briefly touch on is Ashrae does provide some forms in the procedures for commercial building energy audit packet that are marginally useful. They, if we're talking about some kind of a prescriptive requirement, that could be a resource for the jurisdiction to say, hey, we need to at least fill out this set of form for this particular audit type. This one's pretty basic, but I'll bring it up. I think I have it here. It's in Excel. It's got, several several pages here: basic site information, billing information, delivered energy, energy performance summary. This is not what we use when we're doing this work, because we tend to take it to the another step that we'll talk about in a minute, but it's available. And I think that's going to be a theme throughout this talk, is a lot of what you're potentially thinking about doing has been done by other jurisdictions, and looking at prior art and finding out what works and what doesn't in those other places, I think is a really important starting point. The next level, the Ashrae level 1 audit. This one, again, I remember I said it was usually referred to as a walkthrough assessment. The first step, again, is the energy consumption analysis work. In this case, what we typically do, and I think what is recommended, is a little bit more analysis heavy than the preliminary energy audit. So I've shown an example here of us looking at the energy data and fitting a model to it. It's called a regression analysis. Most people use a linear regression for their work. We found that this building uses steam for heating and domestic hot water, and steam buildings, for some reason, tend to not fit a linear model very well. So we use a logarithmic model. The first thing that you can pull right out of here, so this is a model of how much steam is used per square foot per day, how many thousand pounds of steam per square foot per day, against a climatological concept called the heating degree days. And essentially what this allows us to pull is, we can say, we can draw two regions on this graph. Let me clean that up a little bit. And we can say this region below the curve is your base load. So this is energy you use that doesn't depend on climate, doesn't depend on what's happening outside. And this other region above the flat line is climate dependent. So what we see here is this first part is heating energy, and this second part is domestic hot water energy. So without ever going to the site, we can determine how much heat versus how much domestic hot water heating this building is doing. Now that depends on what utilities you're using for what end uses, but it usually breaks out in a way that you can get a little bit more detailed end use analysis out of that. And so that same graph I showed before, we're able to show, okay, so not only can we show your total EUIs, but we can compare heating energy in one building against heating energy in the other, and say, okay, this other building is using a lot more energy overall, but the heating energy is almost exactly the same, and the hot water heating energy is almost exactly the same. So the difference really here is in electrical somehow, and that gives us a place to look when we go on site. So that's the first part of the level 1 assessment, is this detailed energy analysis. The next part is the 1-day walkthrough audit. It doesn't have to be a full day. It doesn't have to be only 1 day, but the idea is you're walking through the building, you're observing what can be easily observed. You may look at, thermostat set points, maybe even thermostat schedules, but you're not, you're not taking detailed measurements of the air conditioning refrigerant charge or something like that, right? That's for a later level of audit. Somehow my markup here is still here. See if I can erase that. Okay. The Ashrae level 1 audit, what kind of reporting comes out of that? Well, again, your benchmarking and your target EUI that you would have gotten from the previous one. Maybe a little more information about benchmarking. Not only what is my total EUI, but what's the energy use breakdown. and how does that compare against other buildings. Anticipated savings if you were to meet whatever target you've defined as a reasonable target, discussion of irregularities, and then we get into the site stuff. So problems or needs identified during the audit, low cost, no cost changes, and rough order of magnitude savings for those. So this is the low hanging fruit, right? This is stuff like, well, you've got two heat pumps serving this same room and they have different settings. So when one's in heating, the other's in cooling, and they're fighting each other, you should probably reprogram that. It doesn't cost you anything, but there's potential savings there. And then a preliminary list of potential capital improvements and some ROM savings there as well, ROM costs and savings. But the detailed analysis of that is really left for a later audit. So we're not going to dive into getting quotes from contractors. Not going to dive into modeling here to determine, like, with high precision what your savings might be. And again, this idea of savings associated with changing your utility rate. So I've just got some sample pages from an audit here, an audit report. This was, we identified some things on the mechanical items, some refrigeration, pipe insulation missing, that kind of stuff. Let's see, this is supposed to have an animation on it. There we go. Some stuff about lighting we identified, some calculations of, what are the savings associated with doing a lighting retrofit potentially. What are our overall recommendations, costs, and savings? Again, these are rough order of magnitude, not detailed calculations, just sort of hand envelope calculations. But because of on this project in particular, because of the benchmarking we had done in advance, that really also informs this step of calculating savings. So, if you know how much heating energy is used rather than how much total energy is used, it's much easier to get an estimate for what your savings associated with turning your thermostat down 3 degrees is. So it's kind of what a report might look like for level 1. Again, tools and existing programs. I'm going to lean on Ashrae again. Procedures for commercial building audits has some sample audit forms. I have found these to be useful. So that's a good tool. I don't know if we brought this up yet, but Seattle's also got a building tune-up ordinance. I don't know if people on this call are familiar with that. It's above and beyond the benchmarking requirement. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but my sense of the tune-up is that it sort of fits somewhere in between a level 1 and a level 2 audit, potentially closer to a level 1. I think the thing that is different on the ordinance is you are required to do certain things if they're found, make certain changes if they're found as part of the tune-up. And obviously an audit doesn't require you to do anything, it's just informational. So that's a slight difference. I put Ashrae Research Project 1050 in here. This is totally nerding out, but this is a tool that describes that regression analysis that I showed earlier. Probably nobody ever wants to look at that unless they're looking for something to help them go to sleep. On to the level 2 audit. So I'm going to move a little bit faster here because, based on my understanding of what this group is interested in, this is kind of above and beyond. This is associated with detailed physical observation of all the major building systems. You're trying to disaggregate to a much finer level than, say, heating, hot water, base load. We're talking about, what are our lighting loads? What are HVAC loads for specific systems in specific locations? Pools, saunas, spas, process loads. So it takes more on-site measurement to figure out how to disaggregate this. But that's important if you're going to do something like a lighting upgrade. If you're going to do a lighting upgrade, it's probably a good idea to go through and count all the existing lighting fixtures, figure out what the energy consumption of each fixture is and how often they're on, and figure out how much energy am I really using for lighting alone. And will that, how long will it then take to pay for that retrofit? There are firms out there that specialize in energy audits that are targeted towards lighting and doing the retrofit as well. And the reason for that is because, we're getting to the end of it, but we've been in a period where there was so much savings available from lighting upgrades. If you're going from like a T8 fluorescent to an LED, you can have a 1-year payback period on the cost of doing the work. And it was heavily incentivized as well. Sometimes it was, cost negative to do the work. In other words, that there was no cost to do a lighting upgrade because you could get so much available incentives and you save so much energy. What else are we doing? In a level 2 audit, you might be reviewing O&M information, interviews, detailed interviews with operation and maintenance personnel. Like I said, a detailed energy use breakdown. The recommendation here is to do an analysis of all practical measures and create bundles of those measures such that you can identify groups of measures that have good payback, say, for the whole group. So in that group, you may have something that has like a 2-month payback, and you want to bundle it with something that has maybe a 3-year payback, because together the payback is still pretty good, and that allows you to do some maybe some needed capital improvements. So again, that's a more detailed analysis, more costly as well. We'll talk about that. And then level 3, even more detailed, a detailed analysis of capital intensive modifications. So for things that are really expensive, you want to spend some time on making sure it's a good approach. The report for this may include actually some schematic design, might include basis of design for systems and equipment. You might be jumping into a detailed life cycle cost analysis here. So that's what we're talking about for level 3. So just a quick summary. I don't want to walk through this because we talked about it all, but what it shows is that, for instance, a level 3 audit will contain all of the activities that a level 1 audit contains and more. It's a process by which you're building on previous work. I anticipate sending this out for people to look at later, so I don't think I want to read through this right now. I've got a similar one for what you can expect from a report for the different levels. Let's jump to the next screen. I did want to talk just briefly. This slide is not super clean and not super pretty, but I wanted to talk about sort of the landscape of how these audits relate to other things. And I think we've sort of already addressed this a little bit, but over here are the levels of audits. Level 0, the preliminary energy analysis, walkthrough, engineering analysis, detailed analysis, some programs. Obviously, this is Seattle centric. We do a lot of work in Seattle because we're in Seattle, but they also are doing, they have essentially created ordinances that require some of this stuff, whereas other counties or cities haven't yet. I would say the benchmarking ordinance is pretty close to an Ashrae level 0 audit. It's a little bit less in the sense that there's no effort towards, there's no required effort on the part of the person doing the work to compare it against other buildings. The Seattle benchmarking program does that automatically. So it's not quite the same. We mentioned the Seattle building tune-up. And again, I said, I feel like that's somewhere between a level 1 and a level 2 audit. And what we didn't talk about too much, but is probably on everyone's mind, is House Bill 1257. This is the clean building standard, or the building performance standard. I think the work that is required on the front end of complying with this is somewhere between a level 2 and a level 3 audit. Again, the difference being that not only do you have to do the audit, but you may have to then do something about it. And audits themselves don't require an action after the audit, but these related programs may. I also wanted to briefly touch on incentives, but I think it would be good if people are interested to talk to somebody from PSE on that in more detail. There are incentives for complying with the building tune-up. I think the anticipation is that it's a little bit more in depth than the required minimum effort for the Seattle tune-up, but not much. But then the incentives I put on here specifically, because there's a lot. The ones I put on here specifically are incentives that not only pay you for making the upgrade, but they pay you for doing the analysis that tells whether you should make the upgrade and which upgrade to do. And since we're talking about audits, which is on the analysis side, I thought I'd just mention that even this analysis work can be incentivized in some cases. So we've got building tune-up incentives from PSE. PSE's got some retro commissioning programs now. Again, retro commissioning kind of sits somewhere in the space between the Seattle tune-up and House Bill 1257. And then there's also an early adopter program for incentive program for House Bill 1257. All that's coming close to expiring at this time. Jump to the next slide. And this may be what people are people are super interested in, and I've sort of left it till the end, and I don't have a lot of information here. But I'm sure everybody's wondering, what does a audit cost? Since we don't have a great database to pull from here internally, I had to look around to figure out if I could find some publicly available resources to determine or to identify costs. This value here, 12 cents to 50 cents a square foot, came from Pacific Northwest National Labs. And this is probably the range for level 1 to level 3. This, a preliminary energy analysis should not cost 12 cents a square foot. And then what can you expect? Where we have data available for that right now is the Seattle Building Tune-Up Program. And they anticipate 7 to 15% savings from going through their program. So that's somewhere between a level 1 and level 2 audit, let's say a level 1.5. That's a pretty significant number. So here's a case study for the Seattle Justice Center. Now, this building is admittedly significantly larger than potentially what we're talking about here. But this cost and savings analysis is pretty interesting. So it cost them $50,000 to do the assessment, or 17 cents a square foot. That's pretty consistent with this other cost range up here. And the cost to actually do the actions that were required by the Seattle Building Tune-Up Program was another 15 cents a square foot. But they anticipated 12 cents a square foot savings in the first year. And then the program does also typically require that you report things that are sort of above and beyond the minimum compliance level. And then identify costs and project savings there as well. So, I mean, you can see that there's a, 27 cents a square foot savings per year, or sorry, no, that's 32 cents a square foot cost for the assessment and the minimum tune-up actions, and 12 cents a square foot savings. So that's what, a 2.5 year payback. That's pretty good, especially if you're addressing capital needs in this as a function of this type of work. What else here? Oh, auditing qualifications. I threw this in at the last minute. I think it as you're trying to design a program, this is something worth considering. What kind of programs are out there that certify energy auditors that you might want to reference So we've got the professional engineer, obviously. Ashrae has a program, the Building Energy Assessment Professional. I got the little, they've got their new stamps that you get for having certain certifications now. The Association of Energy Engineers has 2 programs, the Certified Energy Manager and the Certified Energy Auditor. Those are the main ones that I'm aware of. There's likely more out there. If you're looking for an example of requiring a certification to do a particular jurisdictionally required task, maybe familiar with the Washington State Energy Code, which requires commissioning on commercial building new construction now. They are requiring, in order to be able to do the commissioning work, they're requiring ANSI a certification by an ANSI accredited organization. So the Ashrae's BEAP program is ANSI accredited. I'm not sure that Association of Energy Engineers programs are ANSI accredited. So that's, again, something to consider. What else I have? Oh, the last is I'm compiling a list of resources of things that were referred to throughout the presentation, and these will all be links. So in fact, I think they're all links now. So planning on sending this presentation out after the call, probably in a day or so, and these links will all be available.
Great. Thank you, Lucas. I'm
Sure.
going to let people go ahead and use the raise hand function for questions that you have for him.
Can we go back to full screen?
You mean take down the presentation? Is that what you're saying, Barbara?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I stop sharing. Is that how I do it? Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Well, go ahead, Thad.
In the reading that I've been doing about this stuff, my sense of the principal difference between the retro-commissioning and tune-up programs and the audit programs was that the retro-commission programs don't look at the building envelope. Are there other things? I mean, these are kind of fuzzy categories, as I understand it, with a certain amount of blending between what counts as level 1 and level 2, depending on who's doing the job and so on. Are there other things about the difference between retro-commissioning and kind of medium-level audits that seem as if they're really significant to you?
Yeah, certainly the building envelope being included. I mean, retro-commissioning, I think the opportunities around retro-commissioning are really heavily associated with buildings that have automated controls. That's where, I mean, in fact, the PSE program I mentioned, you have to have an automated control system in order to qualify for that program. The word commissioning on its own can refer to other things outside of control systems and usually does. Those things that are outside of control systems are also probably well covered by auditing programs. So you're talking about, is my refrigerant system fully charged? And am I bringing in too much outside air with my HVAC system? Are my automated lighting controls working? That kind of stuff. Building envelope is a great one. Sometimes the commissioning process can tend to focus on MEP systems where auditing can have a component of envelope. We don't, a lot of times the envelope of a building is kind of what it is. And in fact, if you talk to the code officials here in the city of Seattle, the reason they're so aggressive in the city in terms of envelope requirements is because it's considered to be the thing that lasts for the full life of the building, where your mechanical systems are going to change throughout the life of the building and your lighting systems are going to change. That being said, auditing will oftentimes find opportunities for improvement on the envelope, especially in the area of windows. So.
The more general question I've got is, my sense is that in the long run, we are going to have to, I mean, there's an issue about sort of about doing this in a kind of piecemeal, one step at a time way, as opposed to doing deep retrofits, that in the long run, we are probably going to need significantly bigger reductions from the building energy sector than you're talking about getting from a medium level audit requirement. And that sort of that's going to lead to our doing a piece of something and then needing to do a piece of something else 10 years from now, and maybe to a fair amount of redundancy and sort of sunken assets issues, and, you know, sort of replacing something and having it turn out that really, if we'd done this other thing too, we wouldn't have had to invest as much in the first thing we did. Do you have some sense about what the long-term picture of this looks like?
Yeah, it's scary. You know, from a climate point of view, it's scary. I think the first thing I would say is you're never gonna, well, if we're talking about major systems, you're never gonna pay for the replacement of a major system that's not near the end of its useful life with the savings, with the possible exception of lighting, because we're sort of in this, there was a huge change in lighting efficiencies in a short period of time. But, you know, replacing your gas furnace with a heat pump, I think that's going to be a hard sell until it comes time to replace that gas furnace anyway. So I think my sense is the goal of the audit really is to provide as much information as possible so that you can make that decision. You know, if your personal goals are green, you may pick the most aggressive thing that you can pick when you're replacing your equipment. But and the audit gives you the information to know, all right, well, what's the incremental cost of going with a heat pump water heater instead of a regular gas water heater versus how much is that going to save me over time? Are we going to get there from saving 10 to 15 to 20% on an audit in terms of what our goals are for 2030, 2040 and beyond? I think there's going to have to be more that gets done for sure. I don't think we're going to get there. So this isn't a silver bullet. But you can imagine if you saved 15% on every building in the county, that's not insignificant either. So I think just like everything, we gotta turn all the levers that we can right now, and hopefully there will be more levers to turn in the future.
Chris?
Yeah, I have a question for the commercial realtors and brokers, as well as OLIFED and OMB, the folks involved with the building sector. I'm just curious, you know, given this information, have any of you all had any experience with these types of energy assessments in your buildings? Have you acted on those with improvements to the building, and or what is the payoff on those? What's your experience been? That's the first part of my question, so I'll leave it at that for now. Has anybody had any experience with that?
Well, we have ripe open field ahead of us.
Is there? My experience is that we tend to get brought on alongside of a team that's doing sort of a general capital needs assessment, having to do with other things besides energy. And the energy component is a consideration to make when you're talking about replacing your 20-year-old boiler. Do anyone in here familiar with just sort of the general capital needs assessment process and just not seeing the sort of energy component alongside of that? Or is that something that just doesn't happen at the scale we're talking about here? Sounds like no.
Okay. So I've got the second part of my question is then, does this say for Zach and Evan, Tom, others, does this idea of doing energy audits seem like valuable, like it would be a valuable process for you and provide information that you could use to improve not only the comfort and healthfulness of a building, but also the bottom line. You know, or does it seem onerous? And, you know, how does it feel to you if we're talking about, you know, 15 cents a square foot, that gives you some valuable information that could save you money?
This is Zach. I mean, I can tell you from the management perspective, having to deal with energy audits across over 1 million square feet of space with probably 25 different ownership groups would be quite a tangled mess for us. You know, I think that certainly it's valuable to the owner in the sense that if they're looking for ways that they, you know, like, especially as you were stating, Lucas, when some of these components get to the point where they're at the end of their useful life anyway, I think that those are times where if there's an audit that makes the most sense, it would be at that time to figure out where is their capital best reinvested for the future. And so I think that maybe there are ways that those things could be incorporated to where they're less sort of obtrusive to the normal operations. You know, and then I think it also depends on kind of the size of the building. You know, the more sophisticated the ownership group, in my experience, the more open they are to these kinds of things, because they're looking at, you know, return on investment and where that capital is best placed. Whereas some of the mom and pop owners are really just trying to figure out how can they're using this for their retirement, you know? And so sometimes making these big capital investments up front is just not as likely, not as realistic. And so I think that's kind of how I would see it.
Zach, would CPACER change that in those instances?
Possibly. You know, I think that one of the things that was interesting to me about, sorry, let me back up. The CPACER, you're talking about some of the funding available. Is that correct?
Yeah, the funding that attaches it to the building rather than the owner.
Yeah, you know, I think possibly that Chris and I talked about this as we were trying to develop the pro forma. One of the challenges, if the funding, let's say, is in the form of a grant for an audit, I think, yes, that's very appealing. I think if the funding is a loan tied to the property that goes towards these improvements, it may be, but it also presents some challenges when it comes to transactions and selling the property and getting buyers comfortable with some of those things. Not that they're not overcomable. It's just something that I think really needs to be sort of thought through and worked through. And I know that there's properties that have done it probably successfully. I just think that one of the things we talk about, and Evan could speak to this as well, and Tom for that matter, but when we talk about transactions, you know, it's the less ambiguity, the easier a transaction is. And so we've seen that sometimes with like power purchase agreements for a solar system. Not every buyer is understanding of what that is. And so you create sort of that ambiguity and that confusion and just that extra layer in there. And it takes your pool of buyers and it shrinks it because some people just don't want to get into the weeds with some of that stuff. So I think those are things that just have to kind of be talked through. The only other thing I'd say with the audit, I really liked the idea of changing the terminology. I think that an assessment is going to get much more positive response. But with that said, I think that once people start to get the impression that if they let this happen, it's going to require some sort of an upgrade, I think that's when you'll get more pushback. And so, you know, I think that the powers that be are going to do what they're going to do. It's just, you know, just something that I think is worth considering at least.
So I'd love to keep following up on Chris's question and hear from Evan and Tom, especially in terms of what appealed to you or what concerns did you have as you heard Lucas talking about this.
This is Evan. I didn't have, you know, I was, you know, early on, maybe 10 years ago when we were seeing the lead building, LEED Gold, LEED Platinum, the different classifications came out. There was a couple of years there where a number of buildings were built, specifically to be gold, certified gold, and they were promoting that. What we found was that from a tenant perspective, we couldn't get any more rent for those types of improvements, what they've done with those buildings. And so listening, my first instinct is, I don't think you're going to get a lot of people that are going to want to do this. And so, I think the challenge is how do we, to Zach's point, how do we make it to where, it's, I don't know if an incentive, but just, instead of, I think audit is I think Zach's right on. I think an assessment is a much better, a much better language that people would receive a little bit probably better. But I think, I don't know, I'm still kind of chewing on this. It's like, how do we get these building owners to engage? And how do you sell them on, hey, you're going to make, you're going to save this, or you're going to save that, when a number of these leases might already be, might already have the terms and conditions laid out, and perhaps, they won't be the beneficiary of some of those savings. But again, I'm trying not to look just at the negative side of it. I'm trying to think about more solution oriented. How do we get, how do we get them involved and want to do this? And I think that'll be that's the question that I have. And I don't know that I have an answer for it yet.
It sounds again like CPACER might be important to that. Tom, you want to comment before I call on other folks?
In the absence of Tom's comment, I just wanted to say that, what I heard from Zach is that, if this were required of all buildings immediately, all at the same time, that would be very onerous and create what was the term you used, a hot mess in all of your portfolio. But I think, what that suggests is what we have, I think, already been talking about, that there's certain triggers that would, where the audit requirement or the assessment requirement would kick in, whether it's the, major renovation of a built property, the sale of a building, or replacement of major pieces of equipment that might trigger this. And then it would be, manageable. It would be one building at a time and spread out over time. Hopefully that, is a kind of a moderate approach that we can use that would make it more attractive and less onerous.
Melinda, and then Thad.
I think Chris actually just basically said what I was going to say. If you spread it as a proactive buyer, I always look to see if they can spread different things out. So if you have the cost of the infrastructure versus the cost of the equipment spread out over time, it's much easier. But also, as somebody that actually rents, I'm also more willing to pay slightly more to know that I'm doing good in the world. So if somebody is in an apartment person or somebody that rents an office, I'm actually one of those buyers that would pay a little bit more for that if need be. That's all.
I wanted to jump in real quick on that comment too. And I think the difference may be commercial versus residential, but we work with a big developer here in Seattle, Vulcan, and they've done quite a bit of studies about what kind of rent they can get out of a LEED multifamily building, and based on what level it achieves. And on the residential side, it's actually a pretty big benefit, and that's been the driver for they're pushing the envelope on quite a few of their buildings. And but that being said, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my experience is in multifamily residential, and that's sort of where I understand. So I can imagine the commercial space might be a little different. The other thing I just wanted to bring up, because I don't know if I focused on it enough, but I think that the level 0 concept, the energy analysis, on its own, the benchmarking is very inexpensive, and I think it's very valuable. If for no other reason, then it provides a signal not only to owners but to the jurisdiction as well about well, now where should we focus our efforts? Do we need every building to do an audit at time of sale, or do we need all buildings that are below the 50th percentile to do an audit at the time of sale, or something like that? So.
Thanks. Thad?
Wanted to ask Lucas, our emissions from electricity and building use are going to go to nominally at least zero in not very long. I know that some of these programs are actually focused on measuring and standards about the emissions levels from buildings and not about the energy use in buildings. And I wondered whether you had any sense about why Seattle and King County had stuck with standards about energy use instead of standards about the emissions in buildings.
And Lucas,
obviously doing the emission standard puts a really big incentive on building electrification, which seems like something we are really going to need to do.
if you can answer why a building's emissions will be nominally zero, I'm curious how that worked out.
Well, if your building is an all electric building and our grid is a zero emissions grid, no matter how much electricity your building is using, your official emissions are still zero as far as your building.
But our grid is coal and natural gas, and
well, the coal is going to have to go out of the grid because of the state's clean energy standard in another 5 years, and then we are going to have a nominally zero emissions grid. You'll be able to use 20% gas, but you're going to have to offset it until 2040. So there's some question about exactly how we ought to be thinking about what the actual emissions of that grid with 20% gas and offsets are. But basically, there's going to be a really dramatic reduction in the emissions from electric buildings that is not going to happen for the emissions from gas buildings.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this area, but my two thoughts are, number one, in the city of Seattle, we are almost already zero emissions from electricity. There are other environmental costs associated with that. And so that is, a strong driver for the push to electrification in Seattle. The rate at which the rest of the state and or country's grid is going to move in that direction is, I think that's up for debate. I hope that it continues to, but I think there's also always, it's going to get there faster if we're using less energy because we're going to have to build less capacity. So I think the two things are working together and not sort of against each other. But I think it's, and the third thing I think I would just bring up, and I'm definitely not an expert here, is we should be thinking of energy in terms of life cycle carbon, not just not production-based carbon. So giant solar array may have zero emissions in use, but it may not have zero emissions across its life cycle.
Thank you. As we are starting to head towards the finish line here, I want to give Chris and Zach and Aaron a chance to just say a little preview comment about the pro forma that they're working on. It's not available today, but they're hoping to be able to bring it to the next meeting. Speaking of the next meeting, I have put into the chat a doodle poll, which is for the next meeting. I had hoped that the doodling we did for August would show us, a pattern that we could just duplicate month to month, but it became very clear that people's August vacation schedules were all over the map. And so forget August. Please do fill out the doodle poll in the next day or two. You could do it now, that would be ideal, so that we can get the next meeting set. So with that said, I want to give Chris and Zach and Aaron a chance to say something.
Well, thanks, Lynn. I would like to just first kick it to Zach and have you kind of reiterate what we talked about at the last meeting as to why something like this would be valuable and what it is, and then we can tag team on describing what we're working on.
Sure. Well, I think it's valuable just the same way that I think that when we built the housing affordability model, it was valuable to understand what potential increase in costs in one area due to another area, and how we best can come up with a menu of options, if you will, to figure out how to balance those so that, you know, we get as close to a net neutral as possible. But more important than just, or I guess I should say as important as the financial side, I think so often it's also the messaging side. And I think that, you know, I've been involved in these kinds of conversations for some time now. And I think that from the real estate side, one of the challenges has always been that the messaging around energy efficiency and upgrades and rebates and credits is always pretty convoluted. And I think that the clearer we can make that messaging to the general public, and the more understandable we can articulate the costs and the benefits, and how we can hopefully get those pretty close to a net neutral, I think the better we can do that, the more adoption and acceptance that we'll get with the least amount of, I don't want to say conflict, but just, you know, agitation, if you will. So I think that's the main goal, at least from my perspective. Chris or Aaron might have a different perspective, but from my standpoint, I think that's kind of the main driver behind it.
No, I think that's well said, Zach. You know, I mean, just generally for those who may not have their brains around commercial buildings every day, you know, building developers and owners use pro forma analysis to really understand how their capital is working, what's the, you know, internal return on investment, and then, you know, really that helps to understand and make decisions about where to place capital, you know, for the benefit of the investors as well as the residents. And so, yeah, so what we started to do is try to put together kind of a really simple outline of the various kind of improvements that would be above the current building code, moving toward an energy neutral building. What, you know, whether it's building shell improvements, hot water heating, heating and cooling, windows, et cetera, looking at all those things and how much would it cost in, you know, above and beyond the standard cost, you know, the normal cost of construction. What is the the additional cost of construction on the cost side, and then begin to be able to model the benefit side of how much energy savings or revenue that could be generated from that improvement above the standard building practice. And so, you know, I mean, it's really for folks, you know, for amateurs like myself, looking at a pro forma analysis, it's really challenging to understand the calculus that goes into it. And so, you know, Zach has been trying to help me, and I'm still kind of wrapping my brain around it, understand, you know, how those factor in the cost of capital, the cost of and the internal rate of return that results from this analysis. And so that, you know, again, with the messaging, we can, you know, I think it's going to be useful for us to really begin to educate the whole community, our elected officials, staff, and such about how to use a tool like this to understand the thinking that goes into these decisions. It may also help to kind of diffuse some of the political pressure, you know, sometimes from the left about, you know, just, you know, why incentives are even given to developers. You know, I think it's really important. I think that we, you know, kind of change the dynamic there. You know, some people are never going to be happy, but I think we need to really shift the conversation away from, you know, these are giveaways to this is what's going to make this project possible so we can get the housing we need, and at the same time have housing that's energy efficient, environmentally friendly, and healthy for the residents. So we're working on coming up with this, you know, figuring out what this tool would look like, and we're going to try to do a presentation at our next meeting where we would you know, explain some of this, begin to be able to use it. Thanks, Zach, for your commitment to the time it takes to work on this, and Aaron as well. Maybe Aaron, you've been developing your, you know, our own kind of template for this. Maybe you have a few thoughts to add.
Yeah, no, I think you both, touched on it really well. And yeah, it certainly comes down to just making that case, showing that the dollars invested are going to, have that right return and have the right incentive to developers to make cost-effective buildings, but also buildings that are, environmentally friendly and energy efficient. And and also hopefully, Chris and I kind of talked about this a little bit, but maybe further down the line you can expand that out to just the health benefits, the environmental benefits. There's a whole lot more to it, but I think building that initial case of this is these incentives will have X amount of benefit is a good starting place.
And then if we can take some case studies, run them through this analysis and say, okay, here's the baseline of what the building is planned to be built, or it was built at, and then here's the additional cost that would be done if we did a net zero building or made these improvements. Then we can begin to talk about it and message like, oh wow, there's an actual payoff to doing this, and it doesn't even take that long, and it actually can generate more revenue. We don't know if we can make that case right now because we can't do the analysis without a tool like this. So as far as I know, there's not a tool out there that does this for people. So I think we're kind of cutting some new ground here, and should be valuable not only for the financial analysis but for the messaging.
Well, I want to let everybody hit their hand waving thing for Lucas, and our deep appreciation to him for taking the time to do this presentation for us today. Okay, I see a few people know how to use their hand waving device. There we go. More of them are coming. Yeah, then there's the old fashioned way like this. Yeah. Okay. And thank you all for taking time. August is a tough month to get time carved out. So reminders of the doodle poll, and I'll be sending that out by email as well. And then we'll be able to look at the pro forma next month. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.